There are people in this world who feel everything. They are the ones who notice the sadness behind a forced smile, the tremble in a voice that pretends to be strong, the weight in the air when something is wrong but unspoken. They are the quiet observers, the empaths, and for most of their lives, they are not celebrated for this ability. They are drained by it. Empath is not someone who simply cares. They are someone who cannot turn it off. They absorb emotions like a sponge left in a flood. They carry wounds that don't belong to them. They are the ones who stay up at night replaying someone else's pain. The ones who carry guilt that was never theirs to begin with for years. They endure this invisible storm silently, unnoticed, unappreciated, and often misunderstood. Society paints them as fragile, too sensitive, too emotional, easy to exploit. They are expected to forgive quickly, to give endlessly, to understand without needing to be understood, and so they keep giving until one day something changes. What happens when the quiet one stops absorbing and starts resisting? What happens when the river that has always flowed gently suddenly floods its banks, destroying everything in its path? It is a paradox that few expect, that the most dangerous person in the room may not be the loudest, the strongest, or the most ruthless. It may be the one who has been silent all along, carrying everyone else's pain until they finally decide they've had enough. Compassion can become rage, selflessness can become rebellion, and the empath, once dismissed as fragile, can transform into the very force society fears the most. The one who sees through manipulation, who no longer bends to guilt, who refuses to be drained ever again, because when the healer is broken, when the listener grows tired of silence, when the one who always carried the weight finally puts it down, the world is forced to face a storm it never saw coming. The silent storm, the fed-up empath, the calm sky before lightning shatters it. And it is here, in this transformation, that we uncover why the empath, the one who has always suffered quietly, becomes the most dangerous person of all. Why do some people seem to feel everything more deeply than others? Why does one person shrug off a cruel word, while another carries it for years as if it were carved into their skin? The answer lies in the complex architecture of the human mind. Neuroscientists have discovered that empaths often have hyperactive mirror neurons, the specialized brain cells that allow us to understand and reflect the emotions of others in ordinary people. These neurons create sympathy in empaths. They create immersion. It is as if their nervous system doesn't end at the skin, but stretches outward, absorbing every flicker of joy, sadness, and anger around them. This heightened sensitivity once had an evolutionary purpose. In small tribes, survival depended not only on strength, but on connection. Those who could read others' emotions quickly, who could sense danger or harmony before words were spoken, kept the group alive. The empath was the early warning system of the tribe, the one who felt the tension in the air before the first arrow was ever drawn. But what was once a survival advantage has become, in the modern world, become a kind of curse. Today's society rewards speed, efficiency, and emotional detachment. In a world where everyone is trying to shout the loudest, the empath drowns in noise. Their nervous system is overloaded, their gift becomes exhausted. Here lies the paradox. The empath often appears calm, composed, and soft-spoken, but behind that calm is an internal war. They absorb arguments between strangers, stress from co-workers, the unspoken grief of friends. They walk through life carrying invisible weights that nobody else sees. Every smile hides a scar. Every silence covers a storm. Psychologists call this emotional labor, the invisible work of carrying feelings that do not belong to you. For the empath, this is not occasional, it is constant. They live in contradiction, outwardly peaceful, inwardly fractured to the world. They may look fragile, but the truth is the opposite. It takes extraordinary strength to survive in a world where you feel everything. Amplify tenfold. Consider this. Most people protect themselves by building walls. Cynicism, indifference, coldness. These are shields. The empath, however, walks without armor. Every wound reaches them, and yet they continue to function, to endure. To give that endurance is not weakness, it is survival in its rawest form. But survival comes at a cost. Empaths are more likely to develop anxiety, depression, and burnout. They are magnets for manipulators, because those who exploit know that an empath will always hesitate to fight back. They live in a constant state of overexposure to many voices. Too much noise, too much pain, and still they do not break, or at least not immediately. Instead, they bend, they carry, they endure until the weight becomes unbearable to the empath. The world is louder, darker, heavier. They cannot walk through a crowd without absorbing its tension. They cannot watch the news without feeling every tragedy as if it were their own. They cannot sit in silence without hearing the echoes of everyone they've ever tried to help, and yet they do survive day after day, year after year. But survival is not the same as peace. Every empath lives with an unspoken truth. There is a breaking point, a moment when the dam holding back all that pain begins to crack. This is not weakness, it is inevitability, and it is why the empath, the one who has always suffered in silence, becomes the most dangerous person once that silence shatters. Because when you live your whole life carrying other people's pain, the moment you finally put it down, you are no longer bound by guilt, by fear, or by manipulation. You become something else entirely. And the world is never ready for that transformation. In its purest form, is one of the most powerful forces in human history. It builds families, heals wounds, and holds together the fragile threads of civilization. But what few are willing to admit is that kindness, when seen through the eyes of the manipulator, becomes a weapon, and the empath, with their deep well of compassion, is the perfect target. The first battlefield where this manipulation occurs is the family. Children, who are naturally empathetic, often grow up in households where their sensitivity is used against them. They are guilt-tripped into silence, told they must be the mature one, the peacemaker, the one who sacrifices their needs for the comfort of others. Their role is quietly assigned to absorb dysfunction without complaint. This early conditioning sets the stage for a lifetime of exploitation. The empath learns to carry burdens that were never theirs, and in doing so, becomes easy prey for any system that thrives on self-sacrifice. Same pattern extends into workplaces. The empathetic employee is the one who stays late, who picks up the slack, who absorbs the anger of customers or the pressure of bosses. They are told they are valued for their kindness. Yet this value never translates into power, protection, or reward. Instead, it cements them into a role where their silence and compliance are expected, while those with sharper elbows climb over them to higher ground in corporate structures. The empath becomes the emotional janitor, quietly cleaning up the mess left behind by ambition. But the exploitation of empathy does not stop with personal relationships or workplaces. Entire societies have learned to weaponize kindness. Consider propaganda during times of war. Governments understand that people can be motivated not only by fear but by compassion. Posters of suffering children, stories of innocent victims, pleas for protecting the helpless. These are not always genuine appeals to morality. They are strategic tools designed to channel empathy into obedience. Soldiers march to war not just out of patriotism, but because their compassion for imagined victims has been manipulated into violence in this way. Empathy is twisted into justification for destruction. Consumer capitalism operates in a similar fashion. Advertisements no longer simply sell products. They sell guilt. Corporations craft campaigns that exploit the desire to be good, to care, to belong. Buy this product to save the planet. Subscribe to this service to fight poverty. Donate at checkout or risk appearing heartless. The empath, already burdened by a heightened sense of responsibility, becomes a perpetual customer of guilt-driven marketing. Their compassion is monetized. Their kindness fuels profit margins. Even in cultural narratives, empaths are dismissed as too emotional or too sensitive. Yet these very traits are constantly exploited in media, politics, and religion. Politicians tug at heartstrings while passing policies that deepen suffering. Religious institutions preach compassion, but often weaponize guilt and shame to control believers. The empath is caught in a cycle where their deepest virtue, their capacity to feel for others, becomes the very chain that keeps them subdued. The manipulation is so pervasive that many empaths begin to believe their silence is noble. They convince themselves that self-sacrifice is virtue, that their suffering is meaningful because it spares others, but this is an illusion, carefully constructed by systems that depend on their compliance. The truth is harsher. Their silence is profitable, their guilt is valuable. Their ability to endure quietly is the foundation on which exploiters build their power. This pattern is not accidental. It is systemic, from the smallest family unit to the largest empire. Empaths have been the unpaid caretakers of society's sins. They absorb the pain, they carry the guilt, they take on the emotional labor that others refuse, and all the while, those in power grow stronger, not by their own resilience, but by feeding on the quiet strength of the empath. History reveals this over and over again, from rulers who called for sacrifice for the greater good, to corporations that demand loyalty in exchange for crumbs of recognition. The empath has been drained for centuries. Their kindness is not only unprotected, it is harvested, and like any resource that is overexploited, the well of empathy cannot be drawn from forever when kindness is weaponized. It transforms into a form of control. It keeps the empath locked in a cycle of giving, forgiving, and enduring, while those around them take, manipulate, and consume. But every cycle has a limit, every resource has an end, and when the empath finally realizes that their kindness has been turned into chains, when they understand that their virtue has been exploited as a weakness, something shifts deep inside them. They stop seeing compassion as a duty owed to everyone, and begin to recognize it as a gift meant only for those who deserve it. They stop being silent, they stop being compliant, they stop being drained, and that realization marks the beginning of transformation. Because when kindness is no longer weaponized against them, when the empath refuses to be society's emotional scapegoat, their true power begins to surface. Every human being has a threshold, a moment where the weight of suffering, repression, and silence becomes unbearable for the empath. That threshold is both delayed and catastrophic. They endure longer than most, they bend further than others. But when they finally reach the breaking point, their transformation is not a gentle shift. It is an eruption. To understand this moment, we must step into psychology. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the hidden self, buried beneath layers of repression, denial, and cultural conditioning. For the empath, the shadow is not composed of cruelty or selfishness, but of suppressed anger, unspoken rage, and unexpressed strength. It is the accumulation of every moment they forgave too easily, every insult they swallowed, every betrayal they endured in silence, and like all shadows, it waits for the moment to emerge. Freud described repression as the act of forcing intolerable feelings out of conscious awareness. The empath lives in repression daily. They push aside their own needs to prioritize others, burying frustration under layers of politeness and guilt. But the psyche cannot repress forever. What is buried does not disappear. It grows silently, like pressure beneath the earth's crust. One day, the ground shakes. One day, the volcano erupts. Psychologists studying trauma responses have observed that those who suppress their emotions the longest often react the most explosively. When pushed too far, it is not a gradual awakening, it is an overcorrection. Years of endurance collapse in a single moment, unleashing the strength of someone who has been silently preparing for battle without even knowing it. History, too, is filled with empaths who became dangerous after being underestimated. Take Harriet Tubman, once an enslaved woman seen as powerless and fragile, who transformed into one of the most fearless leaders of resistance in American history. Her empathy for those still in chains did not keep her passive. It ignited her defiance. Or consider Mahatma Gandhi, who began as a timid lawyer, mocked for his quiet demeanor, but whose endurance of oppression transformed into a movement that shook an empire. The same pattern repeats. Those who appear weakest in silence often become the strongest in Revolt, the breaking point, is the moment when empathy mutates. It no longer serves as a leash, keeping the individual bound to servitude, guilt, or manipulation instead. It becomes fuel for righteous fury. The empath, who once absorbed everyone's pain, now sees with clarity who caused it, who profited from it, and who must be held accountable. Their compassion does not vanish. It sharpens into a weapon. It transforms into moral fire. This is why a fed-up empath is unlike any other force. They do not rebel for selfish gain. They do not fight out of greed or lust for power. They rise out of necessity. Their anger is not reckless, but precise. They know human weakness intimately, because they have spent their lives studying it, feeling it, enduring it. They can anticipate manipulation before it arrives. They can sense lies before they are spoken. They can dismantle systems of control because they have lived inside them, suffocated by them. When the empath reaches the breaking point, they stop fearing rejection, abandonment, or guilt. These were the tools once used to control them, but the moment they no longer respond to guilt, no longer bend to emotional blackmail, no longer accept being drained, they become ungovernable. The chains that once held them break, and what emerges is not a fragile soul, but a liberated force with nothing left to lose. Consider the famous psychological experiments by Stanley Milgram on obedience. Most participants followed authority, even when it meant harming others, but there were always a few who refused, who broke the cycle of compliance. Those who resisted were not the loudest or most aggressive personalities. They were often the quiet ones, those who had silently wrestled with their conscience until they could no longer obey that refusal. That breaking point became the most dangerous act of all, the rejection of control. The empath's breaking point mirrors this. It is not an explosion of blind rage, but a decisive refusal to be used any longer. It is the moment they say no, not just to a person, but to a system, and in that no lies the collapse of everything built on their silence. What makes this transformation so unsettling is its unpredictability. No one expects the quiet one to resist. No one anticipates that the giver will stop giving. Manipulators, abusers, and exploiters are blindsided because they mistake endurance for weakness. They forget that endurance, when pushed to its extreme, eventually flips into defiance, and when it does, the empath does not fight with half measures. They fight with everything they had once held back. At the breaking point, empathy fuses with clarity, rage, and strength. It is a fire that does not simply burn. It purifies, it destroys illusions, breaks manipulative patterns, and exposes hidden corruption. This is why the empath, once fed up, is feared more than the naturally aggressive, because their rebellion is not reckless impulse, it is justice, long delayed. The psychological climax of the empath's journey is not that they stop feeling. It is that they finally honor their own feelings as much as they honored everyone else's, and once they do, they can no longer be controlled by the old tricks of shame, guilt, or fear. The breaking point is not the end of the empath. It is the birth of a new self, one who carries all the wisdom of compassion, but none of the chains of exploitation, and that is precisely what makes them the most dangerous person in the room. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when the silence they once endured begins to burn for years. They tolerated the weight of manipulation, absorbed the cruelty of others, and convinced themselves that suffering in silence was a form of strength. But silence has a breaking point. When the empath finally reaches it, they do not simply snap. In anger, they awaken, and that awakening is one of the most dangerous forces the world can encounter. Not dangerous in the sense of violence, but dangerous to illusions, to control, to the fragile foundations of power. A fed-up empath is not unpredictable because they wish for destruction, but because they have seen too much. They have studied the machinery of manipulation, not from books or theories, but from lived experience. They know what guilt feels like when it is weaponized. They know the sting of shame when used as a leash. They have lived inside the fortress of lies and gaslighting, and they know where the cracks are once they stop playing along. No power can shame them into silence again. No threat can bend them back into submission. History shows us this archetype again and again, the quiet figures, underestimated for their softness, who become the very ones to lead revolutions. Literature paints them as the reluctant hero, the character who never asked to fight, but whose endurance sharpened into wisdom. In psychology, we see this as post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where deep suffering forges resilience, so profound it transforms the very identity of the person. Out of wounds comes clarity, out of pain comes power. The fed-up empath becomes dangerous because they are immune to the tricks that once bound them, where others are ensnared by the carrot of approval or the stick of punishment. The awakened empath sees through it. They understand that fear is a tool, that shame is a chain, that guilt is often nothing more than someone else's projection, and once you see through the chain, you are no longer its prisoner. Think of the great movements in history: abolition, civil rights, liberation, struggles across the globe. Many of them were not led by those who were born powerful. They were often led by the quiet, the silenced, the overlooked people who had lived under oppression long enough to understand its every contour. They were empaths in the deepest sense, people who carried not only their own pain, but the pain of their community, and when they finally refused to carry it any longer, the entire world shifted. The same psychology repeats itself. At the individual level, an empath in an abusive relationship may endure years of control. They bend, they adapt, they absorb, but once they recognize the pattern, once the fog clears and they see manipulation for what it is, they stop complying. And the abuser suddenly loses their greatest weapon, the empath's willingness to internalize blame. This is why empaths, when awakened, seem so dangerous. They are no longer playing a role in someone else's script. They become the author of their own. This shift terrifies systems built on control. Employers who thrive on overworked, guilt-driven employees fear the day someone simply walks away. Governments that rely on shame or fear to maintain obedience collapse when enough people stop believing the narrative. Entire relationships fall apart the moment one person refuses to be emotionally blackmailed. The fed-up empath does not need to fight with fists or weapons. Their mere refusal to comply destabilizes the entire dynamic. It is here that we must make an important distinction. The danger of the awakened empath is not their aggression, it is their refusal. They become dangerous precisely because they do not want to dominate. They want freedom, and a person who wants freedom and nothing else cannot be bought, manipulated, or controlled. That kind of person stands outside the game entirely across cultures. This figure has always been mythologized: the sage who walks away from the corrupt kingdom, the monk who sees through the temptations of power, the rebel who never sought a throne, but whose resistance inspired others to rise. These are empaths who became dangerous not to the innocent, but to the system of illusions that fed on their silent. Psychologists describe this transformation as a shift from learned helplessness to learned defiance. At first, repeated pain teaches a person to stop fighting, but eventually, something flips. The same nervous system that once froze in fear begins to ignite in resilience. The trauma becomes data, the wounds become maps, and the empath, once broken, now knows the terrain better than anyone. They can anticipate manipulation because they have lived inside it. They can sense falsehood because they once believed it, and they can walk away from control because they know its cost. This is why the world underestimates empaths at its peril. They are not weak, they are gathering data in silence. They are mapping the shadows, and when the silence breaks, it does not break softly, it erupts with clarity, with refusal, with the kind of power that no system of domination can contain. The fed-up empath becomes dangerous because they are proof of something larger, that even the most manipulated, the most silenced, the most broken, can one day awaken. And when they do not merely free themselves, they destabilize the entire structure that depended on their silence. They become catalysts for liberation. They embody the truth that nothing, not even decades of manipulation, can destroy the will to awaken. This is the danger of the empath, not their fragility, but their rebirth, not their softness. but their refusal to be used against themselves. They do not seek destruction, but their existence threatens lies. They do not seek power, but their freedom undermines control. The world fears them, because once they awaken, they are untouchable, they are resilient, they are ungovernable, they are free, they say. The quietest people hold the loudest storms. The empath has always been seen as the gentle soul, the healer, the one who absorbs the fractures of others and somehow makes them whole. Society treats them like an infinite reservoir of patience, a bottomless well of compassion. But what happens when that well runs dry? What happens when the empath, pushed past their breaking point, begins to realize that their gift has been used as a leash rather than a blessing? This is where the danger begins, not in the empath's softness, but in their awakening for a lifetime. They have been the sponge of humanity's cruelty. They absorbed betrayal, manipulation, narcissism, and silence. They believed their role was to heal what others broke, to carry the burdens no one else would touch. But eventually, a moment arrives when they see the truth, that their kindness has not been cherished, but exploited, that their silence has not been respected, but abused. And in that moment, empathy begins to sharpen into something else entirely. It begins to harden into defiance. Fed-up empath is unlike any other force in human psychology, because unlike raw anger or blind rage, their retaliation is informed by years of watching, listening, and understanding. They know human weakness intimately. They know the subtle cracks in the armor of manipulators, because they spent their lives patching those cracks. They know the vulnerabilities of liars, because they patiently endured their lies. When an empath turns, they do not strike wildly, they strike with precision. Their revenge is not chaos, is surgical, but perhaps revenge is too small a word. What awakens inside them is not the petty hunger to hurt back, but the overwhelming realization that their role has been rewritten, no longer the absorber of pain, but the mirror of it. They begin to return the weight they once carried, and the world, unprepared for such a shift, trembles, because when the empath finally refuses to play the role assigned to them, the balance of power collapses. Those who fed on their compassion suddenly find themselves starving. History has seen this pattern unfold in different disguises. Revolutions often begin with quiet suffering, the masses enduring, until one day their silence becomes unbearable. What was once patience transforms into rebellion. The empath mirrors this on the personal level. They endure far longer than anyone else, but once their line is crossed, there is no return. The bridge is burned, not out of malice, but out of clarity. They finally understand that healing the unhealable is a slow suicide, and they choose life instead. This makes them dangerous, not because they seek destruction, but because they finally see with unclouded eyes. They recognize manipulation for what it is. They hear the lies as clearly as truth. They stop negotiating with the unreasonable, stop saving those who never wanted to be saved, stop giving to those who only took. And in this refusal, they force the world to confront itself. They hold up the mirror, and it is no longer a soft reflection, it is an unflinching glare. The true terror of the fed-up empath is that their defiance carries wisdom. Unlike impulsive rebels, they are not reckless. They have been patient observers of human nature their entire lives. They know the psychological games. They know the hidden levers of guilt, shame, and fear. And once they stop being bound by those levers, they can dismantle them. In others, their defiance is not just fueled by pain, it is sharpened by insight. And wisdom sharpened by pain is the most dangerous weapon of all. So here lies the warning. Every society, every family, every community should fear the day when its empaths decide they have had enough, because the empath does not merely withdraw. They transform. They are no longer the soft shoulder to cry on, but the voice that unmasks, the hand that refuses, the presence that no longer bends. They are proof that even the most patient soul has a limit, and when that limit is crossed, the very structures that depended on their silence begin to fracture. The empath's revenge is not bloodshed or violence, It is the simple but devastating act of no longer absorbing what is not theirs to carry. It is the refusal to bleed for those who would not even offer a bandage. It is the declaration that their compassion is no longer free for the taking, and in this reclamation, the roles reverse. The manipulators, once so powerful, are left to face their own reflection without a shield. The world that once leaned on their empathy suddenly feels the weight of its own cruelty. The question is not whether this will happen, but when. For every empath has a breaking point, every healer, every listener, every nurturer has a moment where their heart grows tired of being treated like a tool. And when that moment comes, the shift is irreversible. Empathy, once taken for granted, becomes a force of reckonings. So I leave you with this. Are we exploiting the empaths in our lives? Are we pushing them toward the edge without even realizing it? And if so, what will happen when they finally decide that enough is enough? The answer is not just personal, it is civilizational. Because when the gentlest among us transform into the most unyielding, it is not merely a change in character, it is a sign of something far larger. The world itself has crossed a line, and the reckoning is no longer a question of if, but when.